How we deal with crisis in the cockpit is important for a pilot. In this episode of In the Hangar, we're talking about emergencies.
I used to be a well-respected member of the aviation community, and then I started flying to Cirrus, and that changed.
Oh, that was great until the engine quit.
And all of a sudden I see these explosions and these trees exploding.
I'm walking away a better pilot because of this discussion.
Hello and welcome to this edition of In the Hangar. One of our most popular episodes we ever had was when we talked about emergencies. So we're back to talk to more pilots about things that they've encountered, because it can really help us as pilots to be able to deal with what happens in the cockpit when things happen. With me today, Cheryl and Tamara. I appreciate you guys coming. Tamara, you're coming back to us for this because you've had more than one. So I appreciate you guys coming. First off, let's just, Cheryl, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do as a pilot?
Well, I'm an FedEx pilot. I'm an MD11 captain and check airman, and I also volunteer for Project Orbis, which is a MD10 aircraft that was converted into a hospital. We travel to third world countries and perform eye surgeries and train doctors there. So.
Oh, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And Tamara?
I run a flight school at Prop Posh Airport in Justin, Texas, and kind of the infamous CFI mom.
Okay, so what I want to jump right into is, let's jump into emergency stories, because we hear about things all the time. We hear everything from Sully to the Southwest Airlines captain who did a fabulous job. So off the bat, what comes to mind when you think about the emergencies that you've had in the cockpit?
My biggest emergency was about 3 years ago, and I had a complete electrical failure in an MD11, which is a glass cockpit. We lost everything, including the batteries. I was taking off out of Kennedy Airport in New York, aimed at Manhattan, and it was quite a shock.
So what happened?
Well, it turns out it was a kind of a perfect storm of electrical problems that in themselves wouldn't have been a big deal, but in combination, we basically, right at rotation, all the generators gave up at the same time, and for some reason the batteries went offline too. So luckily it was day VFR, and just flew the airplane, looked outside, flew the airplane. I couldn't talk to anybody. Ultimately, pieces of the aircraft systems were coming back, but nothing was making any sense. We don't have an emergency procedure for this. We don't practice it in the sim. We were kind of off the reservation as far as that goes. We kind of made up the procedures as we went. Climbed up, turned out over the water to get away from the any kind of cities or anything on the ground. Ultimately, I did get a radio back, and that controller was the difference between making a successful outcome or not on that flight. My first officer also was fantastic. As we got out over the water, and I pull out our book checklist and start trying to figure out what happened. I mean, typically when you have multiple alerts and things going wrong, you try to figure out what's the root of the problem. What is the one thing that caused the rest of this to happen? And nothing was making any sense to me. And I'm sitting there with the checklist in my lap, and my first officer, cool as a cucumber, turns to me and says, Captain, it's taken full aileron and full rudder to keep us level. And I had no idea he was doing such a fantastic job of flying the airplane. And that's the beauty of having two pilots. One pilot flies the airplane, the other pilot deals with the radios and the checklists and has some brain cells to commit to the emergency. So ultimately, I was able to talk to a controller by that point. They were fantastic. I mean, you got to figure New York airspace. A lot going on. We actually were load shedded off of their main system, and we had our own controller, our own frequency for the entire event, which was huge. And flew around. We ultimately, I think what happened was our flaps and flight controls are hydraulically driven, but they're electrically actuated. And so when we had the electrical problem, our flaps come up asymmetrical. So one side came up and the other didn't, so that's why we were having such a hard time controlling the airplane. We decided to configure at altitude, and the air controller brought us back around. And of course, there was a layer of clouds in between there.
Right, of course.
Ultimately vectored us back in, and we landed safely. It was
back at Kennedy?
Back at Kennedy, yeah. So,
how long was that whole thing? So, from the time you took off to the time the emergency, till you lost power, or not power, but electronics, and then to the time you landed?
Well, we lost everything right at rotation.
Right at rotation?
Yeah, right. I mean, it was like,
And it was too late to abort the takeoff.
Oh, yes, at that point, yeah. So it was like right at rotation, everything just kind of went poof, gone. And so we have no screens, and I'm back to my GA days, and I'm looking outside and flying the airplane.
Your first officer is the one who's doing the takeoff, right?
Actually, I was.
You were, okay.
And so our technique at the airlines is, like I said, one pilot flies, the other person does everything else. So I was actually the pilot flying initially at the rotation. So I'm flying, and the departure there has you turn inside of a radial off of VOR. Well, of course, I now at this point have no idea where that radial is.
Right.
Because I have nothing. So I just said, let's turn, let's go out, let's go over the water. Some pieces of his instrumentation started coming back slowly, and I still had nothing. So at that point, I elected to give the airplane to him. He became pilot
because
flying.
he had something to.
He had something, and it allowed me to free up my brain cells to think about what the problem is and kind of shed that duty.
So
to
how
him.
long did you guys fly until you landed? Then?
Probably about 15 minutes.
15.
Yeah. So like I said, there was a cloud layer, so we had to go. I took a chance that it was clear above the cloud deck. It was about a 5,000-foot ceiling, so we climbed up, broke out. Cloud deck was probably 5,000 to 8,000. We broke out, so we leveled at 10,000, where I knew we were away from the ground. Now I have a controllability problem. How am I going to handle this? I'm away from everything. So we actually then configured all the way to almost full flaps and gear down at 10,000 feet, because I didn't want to have a problem as we start reconfiguring to land close to the ground.
And you not be able to put the gear down and everything.
Right, because we didn't know what we were going to have or not have.
You said that you talked to one controller. How did you get radio back to somebody?
Eventually, one of them just started working.
One of the radios.
Just one of the radios, and that's what nothing made sense. I mean, we have emergency power systems, and things I should have had, I didn't. Things I shouldn't have had, I did. Nothing was making sense to me, but I did get the one radio, and that guy, I could have asked him for a vector to the moon, and I think I would have got it. I mean, he really. And afterwards, I actually wrote a letter to him thanking him for his help, and I wanted to explain to him why he did what he did was so helpful, and it was the fact that I didn't have to commit a brain cell and look down to change a frequency and have to explain to the next controller how serious our situation was. And so he was there the whole time. His attitude was fantastic. He was right there with us the entire time. So fantastic, yeah.
And what was found to be the problem?
It was a series of unrelated electrical problems. It was just a perfect storm. It just the wrong things happened on the wrong day all at the same time, and it was an anomaly.
Wow.
And so and the thing that I learned the most from this, that part of the reason I wanted to tell this story was because looking back, I learned from that. I learned I did not declare an emergency early enough. So I'm dealing with this. I've got this going in my head. I get up there, and I don't think that declaring an emergency to ACTC is such a important thing at the moment. Afterwards, and going through the NTSB investigation and all the other things, the company investigation after that, I realized, talking to the FAA, had I said those words earlier, now they kind of almost declared for us by keeping us on frequency, taking everybody else off, giving us our own controller. They kind of did it for us. But had I said those words, and we're all afraid to say those words,
Right.
it allows you so many more resources, and so many people have these procedures. Air traffic control has these procedures, and they're ready to jump into action for you just by the fact that you say those words.
But how could you have done it earlier with no radio? Or did you always have radio?
I did not always have it, but I didn't actually declare until we were up. Probably I don't remember exactly when I did it, but probably up at altitude. I didn't spit those words out right away. There's so much going through your head. It's like, did I screw something up?
Navigate, then communicate.
Exactly. But I wish I would have done that a little bit earlier, and it would have kicked in action all these resources. And we train our pilots at the airlines, use your resources. And that was one resource that I was slow to gather. And I wish, looking back, if I had to do it again, I would have said it a little bit earlier because.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Tomorrow.
Well, as you know, yes, I've probably had more than one a little emergency, minor, pretty minor in comparison to that experience. So that gives me chills.
I don't want to repeat that too.
But, mine are all in the GA category. But I guess one of the most memorable was when I first became an instructor at the ripe old age of 19, I was flying with a student in a 150 from Vernon, Texas to Houston area. I don't remember the name of the little airport I was going to, but that was back in the day when it was still called a TCA, not a Class Bravo. And our little airplane was also not equipped to be allowed to fly in there, but it was always impressed upon me prior to planning this flight that we could call them for an emergency. Being my mother was is retired ATC, it was one of her things to, go ahead and use them as a resource. So I'm grateful that they really tried to make that impression on me, because we were up at altitude and we'd had a couple other little quirks in our airplane, the perfect storm of everything. Starter going out, and then we prop the plane, it gets going again. Little things like this on this trip. And in this case, we got close to Houston. In the descent, the airplane started running, the engine started running rough. Okay, well, my student immediately and he's looking down at his 45, perfect, but I'm immediately, and the airplane's still flying, we're gonna fly, and I made us turn to Houston, which we're not supposed to go in, and I'm already listening to them. So even if I'm not on ATC, I encourage my students to at least be listening to the local flight following, even if you don't plan to talk to them, because I was immediately able to get up on the radio with them and start telling them, I says, I got a rough running engine. Yes, I'm a 150. He says, well, I don't see you on radar. I get that. I'm still coming in. The airplane's still flying, keep flying, right?
Did you have to declare emergency for them to let you in, or?
I didn't say the words again, but at the
Okay.
time the airplane was still running, and he didn't deny me. He was just kind of like, well, you can't come in, but yes, I'm coming in anyways.
Right.
So in that sense, he knew that I was feeling the urgency, and as a 19-year-old, I'm sure my voice level was up to here.
Right.
So I was, no longer sounded like a normal pilot. And he, and eventually, after we went through the checklist a couple of different times, the mixture, the throttle, the keys, the mags, the fuel. I mean, it's a 150, nothing much to do.
Carbis?
Yeah, we looked at that too, and couldn't still make this engine run. And it was like running on half power. I mean, we were just steadily coming down. A couple 100 feet a minute. Not a lot, but when you're at a 150, you didn't get very high probably.
Right.
And sometimes the little guardian angels will sit there and tell you to do something, and you're thinking, if you ever argue with your guardian angel, it's an interesting experience too, because my guardian angel, little voice in my head said, pull the mixture.
Pull the mixture?
Yes, I had said the same thing to it. And I finally said, well, I got nothing else. I'm going to pull that mixture part way out. I'm listening to it, and I pulled it. The engine almost sputters, die. I shove it right back in. That engine roared to life, full power, and we were talking to ATC. They talked with us all the way to our, landing point, which was not Houston in the end.
What was the problem?
I don't know.
Still to this day.
Nope, the
But
engine
you're
ran
an
by.
A&P now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was an AMP then too.
So what would you guess? Why would, if you could
It
pull
was
throttle
like
out
the carburetor just refused to accept the fuel flow, even though we had been enriching it, due to the descent.
So it's kind of like a mechanical reboot.
It works pretty good.
But you never declared emergency.
I did not officially declare the emergency, but it was still one of those, we were immediately talking, because if it got any worse,
So
we
why
were full
is it
on.
as pilots, because the nearest I've ever come to emergency was I had a low voltage indicator at night heading towards the New York area for the first time. I was over Allentown, and first time I was going to fly to Teterboro, and low voltage indicator 930. I was on descent, and I just told them permission to deviate to Allentown, and in training, in IFR training, we'd had a low voltage as we were coming close to the airport, and my instructor was like, just let the tower know in case the radios go out, but make sure you stress to them it's not an emergency. That's what my instructor hammered into me. Make sure you tell them that. And I was like, okay, whatever I do not declare an emergency. So I told them that this is not an emergency, I just want to divert, I've got a low voltage indicator. They rolled the trucks, they declared the emergency at the tower, and everything was fine. But it was funny, they closed the runway. They're like at night going down the runway, make sure I didn't drop any bolts and nuts, and then they came up and took a report from me and everything else. I'm thinking, oh no, now am I in FAA jail or something? But I got one call 2 weeks later. So what was the outcome? Is the plane back in service? Yep. Okay, thank you very much. That was all. So it's not that big of a deal. Why do we have trouble saying those words?
I don't know, and it's it actually I think goes back to human factors and myths in aviation. I think we were all taught. I was taught the same way. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, God,
Don't say those
There's gonna be
words.
lawyers coming down, knocking on your door. Don't say
Right.
those words. And I've learned over time it's not a big deal. And it does open up all those resources. Why are you, like you were saying, you were listening to a frequency. So you're already thinking all these things that are going to help you down the road. So why not use them? And it's not, there isn't a lot of paperwork to fill out. That's always, I don't want to fill out
Yeah,
paperwork.
yeah.
And I think it's a myth, and I think it's been passed down generations. And when you get up, like in the airline, the professional pilot world, we know it's not a big deal. And maybe I do fill out a form, a flight safety report or something. And that's the end of the story. And generally, we'll never hear another word about it.
So even when you had your thing, you knew it wasn't a big deal to declare the emergency.
Absolutely, yeah. And I wish I would have done it earlier, like I said, because it would have opened up these resources that maybe I didn't even know existed to help me. I mean, why wouldn't I? I have my co-pilot, I have this controller, I have all these resources possibly on the ground to help me. Maybe we wouldn't have had such a smooth landing. Why do I not want to take advantage of that? I mean, my tax dollars are paying for those fire trucks to come out there, right? So, hey, let's take advantage of it. So it's just
not so much right now.
I think
with the
in
government.
my case, is, the several emergencies that I've had and, on a few were declared in the end, sometimes it was a factor of, I wanted to see if I could solve the situation first.
Okay.
But I've also learned, in recent years that even if I've solved the situation, an engine goes out, and then I get it running again, they don't consider the emergency over. Because there could be any number of things happening that the pilot is not aware of, what's going on.
Could
in
easily
the,
go back to
back to a scarier situation. So that, a little bit of that is just, I wanted to see if I could fix the situation before I have to say, help me. But
Well, Cheryl and Tamara, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your stories. I think there's a lot here that we can take away. And I guess the biggest takeaway is, don't be so slow to announce that emergency and get the help that I need as a pilot. So thank you very much for being on the show.
thank you.
So thank you for watching. And as always, please share, subscribe, and watch. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time in the hangar.